In the centuries prior to the French Revolution, French authorities used a variety of methods of execution depending on the nature of the crime and the condemned man or woman's place in society. Some of these punishments took on what many would deem quite extreme dimensions of brutality. For example, French murderess, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, from the 22nd of July 1630 to the 17th of July 1676, was sentenced to drink 16 pints of water before being beheaded and then burned at the stake. In the next century, Robert François d'Amiens, from 1715 to 1757, after being tortured for attempting to assassinate the king, had his arms and legs fastened to horses for dismemberment in front of an applauding crowd. Witnesses claimed that his torso somehow survived, so it was burnt at the stake in order to finish him off. The brutality of this punishment influenced opponents of the death penalty. The famous adventurer Casanova witnessed the execution and claimed that he had to turn his face away and cover his ears at times. Thomas Paine, famous for his writings near the start of the American Revolution, mentioned Damiens' execution as an example of despotic governmental tyranny. As such, by the time revolutionary fervor struck France, enlightened men and women called for a more humane and equalizing manner of execution. The revolution began on the 14th of July 1789 with the storming of the Bastille prison. On October 10, 1789, Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine proposed a reform of capital punishment to the National Assembly in France. The king rapidly banned some of the more barbaric forms of torture and execution, and a committee was eventually formed to realize Guillotine's proposed reforms. The king's physician, Antoine Louis, designed the prototype device of a mechanical blade that would quickly sever one's head in a single blow. In 1792, it would claim its first victim. And just before we continue, I do want to say that a lot of the names coming up, they are in French. I'm doing my best to pronounce them correctly, but I'm not going to bat 1,000. Let's get cracking. Number 10. Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, who died on the 25th of April, 1792. Pelletier associated with various criminals during his relatively wicked life. His crimes included assault, robbery, and rape. After one of his attacks, his victim cried for help, which alerted a guard, who then arrested Pelletier. Judge Augustin Moreau heard the case and sentenced Pelletier to death. Now, many highwaymen have been sentenced to death, but Pelletier's historic claim to fame is that he was the first person to ever be executed by the guillotine. Public executioner Charles-Henri Sanson first tested the guillotine on corpses that were donated by a hospital. After being satisfied with the efficiency of the guillotine over the sword, the authorities moved forward with the execution. In the afternoon, Sanson positioned Pelletier on the device and decapitated him instantly upon releasing the bleed. Fascinatingly, the crowd, who were used to more entertaining executions via hanging or breaking on the wheel, expressed their disappointment in the underwhelming spectacle of the guillotine and were actually calling out for the return of the gallows. For better or for worse, these requests were not granted. Number 9. Eugen Weidmann, from 1908 to 1939. From the first public guillotining to the last, Weidmann was a German-born man who schemed to kidnap wealthy French tourists as a way of stealing their money. He also participated in more heinous crimes, including murder. He shot at least 3 men and 1 woman in the napes of their necks. The final murder proved his undoing, as police identified him from a business card that was left at Weidmann's last victim's office. Like a scene from a Hollywood movie, Weidmann initially resisted arrest, shooting at the police. His efforts were unsuccessful, and the wounded and unarmed civil police wrestled Weidmann and knocked him unconscious with a hammer. Now in custody, Weidmann confessed to his crimes. On a summer day in 1939, then 17-year-old future actor of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings films Christopher Lee was among the witnesses of Weidmann's beheading. With that, Weidmann became the final person to be publicly executed via guillotine. Number 8. Hamida Djandoubi, from 1949 to 1977. Whereas Weidmann was the last person to be publicly executed by guillotine, he was not the last person to be executed in that manner. Tunisian-born Hamida Djandoubi lays claim to that infamy. Djandoubi had allegedly tried to force his 21-year-old girlfriend Elizabeth Bosquet into prostitution. Not surprisingly, she did not stick with him. Nevertheless, he did manage to enlist 2 other girls into his employ. These girls witnessed Djandoubi vilely assault Bosquet after kidnapping her. At his home, he beat her and then put a lit cigarette on her breasts and genitals before driving her to a more secluded location where he strangled her and disposed of her remains. A month later, the Tunisian tried again at kidnapping a woman, but this woman fortunately escaped and identified him to police. He was charged with rape, torture, and murder. Djandoubi became the last person ever executed by guillotine when he was decapitated in September of 1977. He was not, however, the last man condemned to the guillotine. Nevertheless, the final people condemned received a sort of reprieve in 1981 when capital punishment was abolished in France. Number 7. Hans Fritz Scholl, from 1918 to 1943, and Sophia Magdalena Scholl, from 1921 to 1943. France is not the only country historically to use the guillotine. Germany also used the guillotine from at least the time of the German Empire, from 1871 to 1918, through the German Democratic Republic as late as 1966. And of course, included in that scope of time was the notorious Nazi German state. Nazi records suggest that over 16,000 people met their end at the guillotine in Greater Germany between 1933 and 1945. Two of the most famous victims are the Scholl siblings. The brother and sister pair helped found a non-violent anti-Nazi resistant movement called the White Rose. The organization produced leaflets urging German opposition to Nazi cruelty. The Gestapo would not tolerate such dissent in a time of world war, and so arrested the leaders of the White Rose and beheaded them. Sophie's last words were, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Her brother's final remark was simply, "Long live freedom." They have since been honoured on post-war German stamps for their courage. After all, while they may not have stopped the Nazis, the ilk responsible for their executions did get their comeuppance in the end. Perhaps fittingly, the last German executed by guillotine was none other than SS member Horst Paul Sylvester Fischer, born the 31st of December 1912. For his crimes committed at the Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II, he was guillotined on the 8th of July 1966. Number 6. Marie Anne Charlotte de Corday d'Armont, 1768 to 1793. Charlotte Corday is without any doubt one of the most famous female assassins in world history. The young woman read the works of Enlightenment-era philosophers and grew horrified with the carnage unleashed by the French Revolution. She supported the revolution, but not the bloodshed that occurred. For example, she did not think that it was right that the king was executed. She blamed radical Jacobin Jean-Paul Marat for much of this bloodshed, and as she said at her trial, she killed one man to save 100,000. She went to see Marat on the false claim that she had knowledge of an uprising against the revolutionary government. Marat, who suffered from a terrible skin disease, spent much time in a bathtub. They had a meeting, and she drew out a knife and stabbed him in his chest, slicing into his aorta and lung. Marat called out for help, but he died anyway. Corday was condemned for the murder. Reportedly, after her beheading, a man lifted her head from the basket and slapped it. Witnesses claimed that she made an expression of indignation as a result. The man was then imprisoned for 3 months for his actions. Corday became something of a hero for many and received the nickname the Angel of Assassination. Number 5. Alexandre François Marie de Beauharnais, Vicomte de Beauharnais, from 1760 to 1794. Beauharnais was a French nobleman who served as deputy in the Estates General and later as president of the National Constituent Assembly before ending his career as general-in-chief of the Army of the Rhine. He was arrested for lack of military success and his aristocratic connections, and he was sentenced to death during the Reign of Terror. On the one hand, he might just seem like another noble guillotined during this time. However, his place in history is significant largely because he was executed. His wife, Josephine, who was imprisoned in the same prison as her husband, survived him and was freed when the Reign of Terror ended. She went on to marry Napoleon Bonaparte and became the first ever Empress of the French. Her grandson later became Emperor Napoleon III. Had Alexandra lived, would Josephine have married Napoleon? What if Josephine was guillotined at the same time as her husband? A 1927 movie about Napoleon reenacts the fateful moment when Alexandra is taken to be executed from his distraught wife in prison, showing one of the many tragic moments in a bloody revolution. Number 4. Olympe de Gouges, from 1748 to 1793. Olympe de Gouges was actually born Marie Gouges. She was the quintessential feminist author of the French Revolution. In 1791, she responded to the Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen with her own declaration of the rights of woman and of the female citizen. She dedicated it to Queen Marie Antoinette, who was still alive at that point. In the document, she writes that the purpose of any political association is the conservation of the natural and the imprescriptible rights of woman and man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and especially resistance to oppression. In addition to calling for gender equality, she also advocated abolitionism and was recognized by many others who opposed slavery. Her ideas were, however, too much for the Jacobians, the ruling political party in France. She was arrested for alleged monarchic sympathy and executed shortly afterwards. One of her plays dealing with slavery was also burned after her death. Her major causes, equality for women and the abolition of slavery, would come some time after her death. Slavery was finally abolished in the French colonies in 1848. Women finally received the right to vote in France in 1945. Given how long it took France to realize these dreams, one should get a sense of just how brave she was for espousing such ideas when she did. A leading French politician and former presidential candidate in 2007 and 2012, Ségolène Royal, has suggested that de Gouges' remains be moved to the Pantheon in Paris in a ceremonial manner, as her actual burial place is uncertain. Number 3. Georges-Jacques Danton, from 1759 to 1794. According to author Victor Hugo and filmmaker Abel Gance, Danton is considered to be one of the three gods of the French Revolution alongside Marat and Robespierre. A fiery orator famous for saying, "We need audacity, and yet more audacity, and always audacity," Danton played a critical role in both the overthrow of the French monarchy, an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years, and the establishment in its place of the French Republic. This lawyer and politician belonged to the Corday political party during the Revolution and supported the execution of the king. When Marat was still alive, the revolution was under an almost unofficial triumvirate, if you will, of Marat, Danton, and Robespierre. If you study history, remember what happens to triumvirates when one of the three members is eliminated. In the case of the first triumvirate in ancient Roman times, it did not take long after Marcus Crassus's death for surviving members Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus to engage in a civil war against each other. In the period after Marat's murder, Danton and Robespierre's factions drifted apart. Danton's opponents accused him of financial corruption, and they arrested him. Before being guillotined, he said to the crowd, "My only regret is that I am going before that rat, Robespierre." And then to his executioner, "Don't forget to show my head to the people. It's well worth seeing." Number 2. Maximilien François Marie Isidore de Robespierre, from 1758 to 1794. Danton's implication that he was merely going before Robespierre was proved prophetic. Months after Danton's execution, Robespierre would indeed get his just desserts as well. Robespierre is hands down the most famous French revolutionary leader of the Reign of Terror. This radical Jacobean lawyer and politician strove to purify France during the Revolution, despite having once composed a prize-winning speech to welcome the king to his school when Robespierre was a student. As the revolution progressed, he spoke out against or otherwise eliminated his possible rivals. He argued that the king must die so that the nation may live, and remained in power during the execution of such other leading figures of the revolution like Corday, de Gouges, Beauharnais, and Danton, among thousands of other victims of the Reign of Terror. Robespierre continued to eliminate anyone deemed a threat, with cartoons even depicting Robespierre guillotining the executioner. With his establishment of a Festival of the Supreme Being to replace Christian celebrations, Robespierre had himself depicted in a manner that seemed to witnesses as a sort of modern Moses, which was too much for the French populace. On the 26th of July 1794, Robespierre gave a speech implying a conspiracy without naming any names. Fearing they might be next to be targeted by Robespierre, various members of the National Convention rose up against Robespierre before he could accuse them. As Robespierre tried to speak in his defense, he was shouted down, with one of the men saying, "The blood of Danton chokes him." The fall of Robespierre, known as Thermidor, is masterfully recreated once again in Abel Gance's film about the early years of Napoleon. Robespierre tried to avoid the public humiliation of an execution by shooting himself, but botched his suicide. He shattered his lower jaw, which bled until a doctor wrapped it. Before beheading him, the executioner ripped off the bandage on Robespierre's jaw, causing the defeated man to scream in agony. His attempt to create a republic of virtue having ended along with his own life. Robespierre was not executed alone, however. Also executed on the same day as Robespierre were his various colleagues, including most prominently his right-hand man, Louis de Saint-Just. However, there is yet one pair of guillotine victims that is even more significant in history than even Robespierre and Saint-Just. Number 1. Louis XVI, from 1754 to 1793, and Marie Antoinette, from 1755 to 1793. Louis and Marie are not the first king or queen to be beheaded. English Queen Charles I, Scottish Queen Mary, as well as English Queens Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Jane Grey are among the well-known decapitated European royals prior to Louis and Marie. Yet these particular French monarchs are the only husband and wife duo in royal history to both be executed by beheading. They came to the throne in 1774 following the long but disastrous reign of Louis XV, who had lost many of France's colonies, as well as French prestige in the catastrophic 7 Years' War. As an attempt at revenge against England, France joined America in its Revolutionary War for Independence from 1776 to 1783 at great financial expense. The financial expense occurred alongside other problems for the French state. By the late 1780s, while France experienced some harsh weather conditions and correspondingly bad harvests, enlightened ideas that challenged the divine rights of kings and absolutism also spread. Meanwhile, the Queen became a target of dissatisfaction, being regarded as out of touch with her people and living a life of luxury. She was most notably scandalized during the affair of the diamond necklace, in which she was falsely implicated in a conspiracy to try and defraud crown jewelers in order to obtain an extravagantly expensive necklace. She had earlier been ridiculed for the long time that it took her and Louis to produce an heir. By 1789, conditions were so desperate that for the first time in over 100 years, the French monarch called the Estates Générales, a sort of legislative body, to address the fiscal crisis affecting France. Instead of this working, a revolution broke out. Louis and Marie meant well and believed what they were doing was righteous, but they were in over their heads and lacked the personalities to resolve such serious problems. Louis recognized as much. When he became king, he even said, "Protect us, Lord, for we are too young to reign." He attempted to survive during the revolution as a constitutional monarch, but when it became clear just how bad things were getting, he and his wife also attempted to flee to his wife's homeland of Austria in June of 1791. They were captured before reaching the border and returned to Paris, where things became far, far worse. Afterwards, the attempt at saving his monarchy seemed futile. Just a few months later, revolutionaries voted to execute the king. His final speech was cut short by a drum roll, and then he was beheaded, with conflicting reports of whether or not he was beheaded with 1 or 2 drops of the blade. Marie Antoinette survived him for several more months. In October of 1793, her hair was cut off and she was driven in an open cart to her place of execution. She apologized to the executioner for stepping on his feet and was then beheaded. She has since become a major part of popular culture. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. And don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. If you're looking for something else right now, why not check out something else I do? It's not actually a YouTube channel. It's a podcast called The BrainFood Show. If you plug that into iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, just BrainFood, one word, you'll find it. Subscribe. Let me know what you think. And as always, thank you for watching.